The moment the customer slammed the door in his face, muttering, "Took you long enough," Mark Carter knew something was wrong with his company. Mark had built his delivery service from the ground up, expanding it to over a dozen locations. Lately, complaints had been piling up: late deliveries, rude drivers, and exhausted employees quitting without notice. Reports from his regional managers didn't add up. So, instead of relying on second-hand information, he decided to find out for himself. Disguising himself with a scruffy beard, dyed hair, and a fake name on his uniform, Mark got himself assigned as a delivery driver at one of his busiest locations. He had never personally met the employees here, so no one recognized him. His first day started with a sinking feeling. The warehouse was a mess: packages stacked haphazardly, workers moving frantically under the sharp eyes of the shift manager, Greg. "Move faster," Greg barked at a young driver struggling to load his van. "You think customers are gonna wait for your incompetence?" Mark tightened his jaw. The kid looked exhausted, his uniform stained with sweat. Mark's first few deliveries were rough. The routes were packed, and the GPS system was outdated, often leading him to wrong addresses. When he returned to the warehouse, he saw something that made his blood boil. A female driver, Maria, was standing with her head down while Greg berated her. "Maybe if you weren't so slow, I wouldn't have to clean up your mess," Greg sneered. "I am doing my best," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your best isn't good enough," Greg scoffed. "Maybe this job isn't for you." Mark clenched his fists. Maria was one of the top-rated drivers according to customer reviews. Why was she being treated like this? Later, during a break, Mark sat with Maria and another driver, Jamal. "Is it always like this?" he asked. Maria gave a hesitant nod. "Greg's been like this for months. If you mess up even once, he makes your life miserable." "He's the reason people quit," Jamal added. "But complaining won't change anything. The higher-ups don't care." Mark felt a pang of guilt. They thought no one above Greg was paying attention. That was on him. The final straw came that night when Mark witnessed Greg deliberately assigning Maria the worst routes: long distances, heavy loads, and late-night deliveries, while giving himself and his buddies the easier ones. Mark had seen enough. His company wasn't just struggling, it was rotting from the inside. And tomorrow, Greg was in for a surprise. Mark arrived early the next morning, blending in with the other delivery drivers as they clocked in. The warehouse was just as chaotic as the day before, maybe worse. Packages were stacked haphazardly, labels peeling off, workers scrambling to sort through the mess. Greg stood in the middle of it all, barking orders. "Move, move, we've got a full schedule today, and I don't want to hear excuses." His voice cut through the warehouse like a whip. Mark stayed quiet, observing. He needed to see just how deep the problems went. The broken system. By mid-morning, Mark was already behind schedule. The company's route planning software was outdated, sending him on inefficient paths that wasted time. Addresses were mislabeled. Heavy packages that should have been assigned to a two-person team were dropped on individual drivers. At one stop, he knocked on a door. A woman answered, arms crossed. "Took you long enough," she muttered. Mark apologized, even though he wasn't at fault. As he walked back to the van, he checked his delivery log. This package had been marked for delivery yesterday. No one had even attempted to bring it to her on time. It wasn't just one mistake. As the day went on, he noticed dozens of late deliveries, missing items, and frustrated customers. This wasn't just inefficiency, it was negligence. At noon, Mark returned to the warehouse for his lunch break. As he stepped inside, he heard raised voices. "Maria." She stood near the loading docks, holding a clipboard, her hands trembling. Greg loomed over her, his face twisted in anger. "You think you can just change your route. You follow orders or you're out." I wasn't changing it, Maria stammered. The system glitched, I was just. Greg snatched the clipboard from her hands and threw it against the wall. You don't get to make decisions, you're here to do what I say. Something inside Mark snapped. Enough. He stepped forward. Hey, leave her alone. Greg turned, narrowing his eyes. Stay out of this, rookie. Mark didn't move. She's not doing anything wrong. The system is messed up. I've seen it myself. Greg scoffed. Oh, look at you, Mr. Expert. Been here 2 days and you think you know everything. Mark clenched his jaw. He was this close to ripping off his disguise and ending the charade. But not yet. Not here. Maria's eyes darted between them, fear written all over her face. She looked like she wanted to say something, but didn't dare. Greg smirked. If you don't like how I run things, maybe this isn't the job for you. Mark took a deep breath. Maybe it's not the job for you. Greg's face darkened. What did you just say? Mark stepped back. Nothing, not yet. But tomorrow, Greg was in for a reckoning. Mark arrived at the warehouse the next morning with a weight in his chest. He had seen enough. The toxic leadership, the broken systems, the mistreatment of employees. This wasn't just a bad manager. It was a deep-rooted problem, and it ended today. He walked in, blending with the other drivers as usual, but this time, he wasn't here to deliver packages. He was here to deliver justice. The final straw. Greg was already in full force, barking orders at the exhausted workers. You, move faster, we're behind already. His voice echoed through the warehouse, filled with the same aggressive arrogance Mark had come to expect. Maria stood by her van, hands gripping the clipboard tightly. Jamal was helping another driver lift a heavy package, something Greg should have assigned extra support for. But, as usual, the workers were left to struggle while Greg stood back and criticized. Mark took a deep breath, now or never. He stepped forward. Greg, his voice was calm but firm. Greg turned, brows furrowing. What? Mark didn't hesitate. He reached up, grabbed the fake beard, and ripped it off. A gasp rippled through the warehouse. Maria's eyes widened. Jamal nearly dropped the package. The other workers froze. Greg's face twisted in confusion. What the hell? Mark pulled off his cap, running a hand through his natural hair. The disguise was gone, and in its place stood Mark Carter, CEO, owner, the man Greg had been mistreating without knowing. Silence heavy, tense. Then Greg laughed, a short disbelieving sound. This is a joke, right? Mark didn't smile. No, it's not. Greg's expression shifted, his confidence wavered. You're not. I am. Mark took a slow step forward. Mark Carter, founder of this company, the man who signs your paychecks. And for the past few days, I've been working under you, watching you. His voice dropped. Listening. The blood drained from Greg's face. Mark turned to the employees. I built this company from nothing, from a single van and a promise to my customers that we would be better than the rest. He exhaled. But what I've seen here, it's not just disappointing, it's disgusting. The workers stood frozen, eyes darting between Mark and Greg. Late deliveries, terrible routing systems, a warehouse that's barely functioning. Mark's gaze hardened. And worst of all, a manager who abuses his own team. Greg straightened. Now hold on. No, Mark's voice cut through the air like a blade. I've seen how you treat Maria, how you treat all of them. The way you assign routes to make their jobs harder. The way you scream at them instead of fixing problems. The way you punish good employees who care more about this company than you ever have. Greg's jaw tightened. This isn't fair. Fair? Mark let out a bitter chuckle. Fair is Maria getting the recognition she deserves instead of being pushed down. Fair is Jamal not having to break his back carrying packages alone. Fair is you being held accountable for the mess you've created. Greg swallowed. Look, I was just trying to keep things running. Mark took another step forward. By breaking people, by running them into the ground and making them hate their jobs, his voice rose. This company doesn't need managers like you. Greg's hands curled into fists. You can't just. I can, and I am. The warehouse was dead silent. Mark exhaled slowly. Greg, you're fired. The words hit like a hammer. Greg's face turned red. You can't do that. I just did. Mark's voice was ice. Security will escort you out. Greg turned to the employees. You all know me. I run this place. You really want to work under him? He pointed at Mark, desperate. The workers didn't move. Maria, Jamal, the others, no one spoke up for him. Greg's breath came fast. I. Leave, Greg. Mark's voice was final. For a long moment, Greg stood there. Then, with a furious glare, he grabbed his things and stormed out. The warehouse doors slammed behind him. Then, a slow, quiet exhale from Maria. Relief. And then, something unexpected. Applause. One by one, the workers started clapping. First Jamal, then Maria, then others, until the warehouse was filled with the sound of gratitude. Mark took a breath. This is what leadership should be. But he wasn't done yet. Mark turned back to the employees. Greg is gone, but that's not the only thing that's changing. He looked at Maria. You've been one of the best drivers here. You care, you work hard, and you've been treated like garbage. His eyes softened. That ends today. Maria's lips parted. Sir, You're being promoted to shift supervisor. Mark smiled. I need leaders who actually respect their teams, and you've earned it. Maria's hands shook. I don't know what to say. Say yes. Tears glistened in her eyes. She nodded. Yes. The workers cheered. Mark turned to the rest of the team. We're fixing the routing system. We're updating the warehouse organization. And most importantly, we're making sure no one here is treated the way you've been treated. A weight lifted from the room. Hope spread through the faces around him. Mark let out a breath. He had come here looking for answers, and he had found so much more. This wasn't just about a failing warehouse. It was about rebuilding trust. And this was just the beginning. The warehouse was still buzzing with energy. Greg was gone, Maria had been promoted, but Mark knew this was just the first step. The real work was about to begin. He looked around, at the exhausted workers, at the piles of disorganized packages, at the outdated systems that had been failing them for far too long. Mark had built this company from the ground up, but somewhere along the way, he had lost touch. He had trusted reports, trusted middle management, trusted that things were running smoothly. He had been wrong. And now he was going to make it right. Mark turned to the employees, his voice firm but steady. First things first, we're shutting down this warehouse for the rest of the day. A murmur rippled through the group. Confusion, uncertainty. Jamal frowned. Shutting down. Mark nodded. For too long, you've been running on fumes, dealing with broken systems, impossible schedules, and a manager who didn't respect you. That ends today. Maria looked stunned. But what about the deliveries, the backlog? Mark smiled. We'll handle it. I'm calling in extra support from nearby locations. But all of you? His gaze swept across the room. You're going home with full pay. Silence, then. You're serious? A worker in the back asked. Mark nodded. Very. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, expressions of disbelief turned to relief. Jamal let out a low whistle. Man, I've never seen anyone do that before. Mark chuckled, maybe that's the problem. He turned to Maria. Before you leave, I need you and Jamal to stay for a bit. We've got work to do. Fixing the root of the problem. An hour later, Mark, Maria, and Jamal sat in the office, surrounded by stacks of reports, messy schedules, and a computer that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. Mark ran a hand through his hair. All right, tell me everything. No filters, no sugarcoating. Maria hesitated, but Jamal leaned forward, arms crossed. You really want to know? Mark met his gaze. I wouldn't be here if I didn't. Jamal exhaled. All right, the routing system, a mess. Half the time, GPS sends us to the wrong place. The other half, it gives us routes that make no sense, wasting fuel, time, and patience. Maria nodded. And the package tracking? It's unreliable. Customers get delivery notices before we even arrive. Sometimes, they get notices for packages that never left the warehouse. Mark frowned. What about staffing? Maria sighed. We're always short-handed. Greg kept pushing people out, and no one wanted to stay because of how toxic things got. Mark leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. This wasn't just a Greg problem. This was a systemic problem. Mark pulled out his phone. All right, here's what's happening next. First, he called the tech department. We need a full system audit, the routing software, the tracking system, everything. I want it fixed. Immediately. Next, he called HR. I want a hiring push for this location, and a full employee retention plan. We're raising wages, improving benefits, and making sure managers actually support their teams. Then, he called his board of directors. That conversation wasn't easy. They pushed back. A full warehouse shutdown, higher wages, system overhauls, that's expensive, Mark. Mark's response was simple. You think losing good workers isn't expensive? You think losing customers because of late deliveries isn't expensive? If we don't fix this now, we won't have a company left to run. A silence. Then, reluctant agreement. With the calls made, Mark turned back to Maria and Jamal. You two have been holding this place together, he smiled, and that doesn't go unnoticed. Jamal raised an eyebrow. What are you saying? Maria, you're not just a shift supervisor. You're being promoted to warehouse manager. Maria's eyes widened. Wait, what? Mark grinned. You care, you lead, you listen. That's the kind of leadership we need. Maria's hands shook. I don't know what to say. I say yes. Tears welled in her eyes. She nodded. Yes. Mark turned to Jamal. And you, how do you feel about leading a driver training program, making sure new hires know the best routes, the best way to handle deliveries? Jamal blinked. You trust me with that? Mark chuckled. After everything I've seen, I'd be stupid not to. Jamal grinned. Hell yeah, I'm in. Mark stood looking around the office. The chaos, the exhaustion, the mess that had been left behind. No more. He walked back into the warehouse, taking one last look at the place he had once thought was running smoothly. Then, he turned to the workers who had gathered near the exit, waiting for their final instructions before heading home. This isn't just a one-time fix, Mark said. I'll be back, regularly, not as a CEO sitting in an office, but as someone who works with you. Because this company, you are the heart of it, and I won't forget that again. The workers exchanged glances, then applauded. Mark felt a lump in his throat. This was leadership. And this was only the beginning.